and this notebook.
You know what's funny is it's all just like random stuff that my mom would reach out to me and be like, hey, I was cleaning out the house and I found your old Walkman, or I found your old Game Boy, or your old, I don't know, just random stuff. And she's like, do you want it? And I'm like, well, not really, but yeah, send it up to me. You know, I don't want to tell my mom, no. So I was like, yeah, send it up. So she sends it up, and then I start messing around with it. I'm like, oh, these things are pretty cool. And then I just set them around.
That marketing background.
Yeah, exactly.
One quick question: your shelves in your back, did you make those or did you buy those?
Actually, I bought them. I bought them from Hobby Lobby.
Awesome.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but it's a craft store.
Yep. No, I am. Thanks. I like them.
They're very inexpensive too. I want to say, I think each one was like $9.99, $20 for the set.
Wow.
Yeah. They're actually not very well built either. I'm always afraid that if you slam my door, one of them is going to fall off. But they look good, and they've stayed up for the last couple of years. So,
yeah.
But you wouldn't want to put anything very heavy on any of them.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, we have 2 minutes to the bell.
2 minutes.
A 2-minute warning.
2-minute warning. You're right.
And we are live on YouTube and Facebook.
Okay, excellent. Hello, YouTube and Facebook.
Yeah, right now we have another 100 people on YouTube and Facebook. Yeah, I think people are coming in.
Okay.
We have more than 1,000 people sign up for today's seminar.
Wow. Amazing.
Yeah.
Popular, Mark.
Let's see.
Okay, 1 minute to the bell.
1 minute.
Get your van finished yet, Mark?
I wish. I'm trying not to rush it, because I know that once it's done, I'm going to look back going, oh, that was a lot of fun. But now that when I'm in the midst of going through it, it's a lot of work. It is. Yeah. But it's fun. I'm learning a lot. That's for certain.
That's good.
Looks great.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Not bad for a guy that's got no clue what he's doing.
So, Mark, we're headed to the coast in the morning. Where's your best place to shoot on the coast?
I love the lighthouses.
Okay.
Yeah. So
favorite one?
Probably Hatteras.
Hatteras?
Yeah, that's probably my favorite one. But I think North Carolina's got great lighthouses. The coast can be a little bit challenging because we don't have a lot of rocks or stones or boulders or anything. It's just kind of like those white sandy beaches. But yeah, I think we have some of the best lighthouses on the East Coast.
Yeah, there's no mountain.
Yeah, no mountain. Yeah.
No northern light, nothing.
No, definitely no northern lights.
Okay, it's 8 p.m. So let's start. Are you ready, Mark?
I'm ready, yeah.
Okay, so welcome everyone. Welcome to the 5th episode of NiSi Seminar. So today we are honored to have Mark Denney with as our speaker. And Mark is an outdoor and landscape photographer based in North Carolina. So he's going to share with you how to get a better images of waterfall. And I think he's going to share some tips of post-processing as well today. So just a few words about housekeeping. So we will have the Q&A session after the Mark presentation. So we should about after 1.5 hours. And for those of you who are on Zoom, so you can keep your question until the Q&A session, or you can leave your question on the chat room. And for those of you who are on the Facebook and YouTube, please leave your question in the chat room or the comment section. Okay, I will monitor the question and I'll bring them up in the Q&A session. Okay, so with that, I will pass the mic to Mark. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you very much. Let me share my screen here. Let's see that, share, play. Let's see. Does it still have that bar at the top?
Yeah, but it's okay.
Hold on, I think I know how to remove it.
Okay.
Let's see here. And
Bottom of the screen. I don't know.
all right. How is that?
Okay, Mark, you have to unmute yourself. I just mute everyone, so you have to unmute yourself right now. Mark, you have to.
Yeah, there we
Yeah. Okay. Got.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
All right. Now, do you see that little bar at the top anymore?
No, you stop sharing the screen, so you have to share the screen.
Ah, these things are always fun. Share screen. Here we
Yep.
go. Okay. How is that?
Yeah, he should be gone. It's gone, I think.
Perfect. All right. So thank you all very, very much for attending this this webinar. The response to this is absolutely overwhelming, and I want to thank you all very much. I understand how valuable everybody's time is, especially in the evening time. So to carve out some time to spend it with me to talk about something that I'm super passionate about, of course, outdoor and landscape photography, but specifically waterfall photography, I really do appreciate that. So I just wanted to make sure that I spent a brief moment in the beginning, just recognizing that the time that you all spent tonight, and I do appreciate it. So thank you. So photographing majestic waterfalls, that is the topic of conversation this evening. And for those that are not familiar with who I am, my name is Mark Denney. I am an outdoor and landscape photographer based out of beautiful North Carolina. And I wasn't always a photographer. I actually spent 17 years in corporate America. I worked in a financial marketing firm and basically helping financial institutions become more profitable via marketing. I know it sounds absolutely riveting, and it really was, but about 2 years ago is when my journey into becoming a full-time photographer really began. And I remember growing up hearing people say things like, if you enjoy what you do for a living, you'll never have to work a day in your life. And I always thought to myself, I was like, that's a dream, that's a fairy tale. That doesn't really happen to ordinary people like myself. And lo and behold, I feel like I'm now kind of living that. And the last 2 years have been absolutely tremendous for me. And all of this is so new. A lot of people think that I've been doing this for, 5, 10, 15 years, and I haven't. It's just been a couple of years. So I'm learning a lot and figuring out a lot here and there. And it's been a great opportunity for myself. I'm definitely thankful for it. So that's kind of a brief overview of my background. Now, as far as kind of why waterfalls, I get that question a lot. Like, what do I love so much about waterfall photography? And it's basically the fact that, one, I live in North Carolina, and there's a ton of waterfalls in North Carolina. It's one of the states in the U.S. that has the most waterfalls. So where I live is about 2 hours from the
I'm
coast.
sorry, Mark. I'm sorry, Mark. Excuse me. Sorry for interrupting. So
No,
there's a weird big gray bar on the presentation. I'm not sure what is that. You want to try to exit the full screen and re-enter again?
Let's see here.
Yeah.
Is that better?
No, it's still there. There's a big gray bar on the right and on the top.
On the right and on the top.
Yeah.
Oh, I think it's because I have all of that. Is that a little bit better?
Yeah, it's gone, but it's still a little bit left.
It's a here. How about now?
Yeah.
Is that
Still there. It's a little bit left.
okay? I think I know why. It's the picture of everybody else.
Okay.
Let's see if I can. Let me hit. I think I saw something in here. It says.
Yeah. There's something here. Yeah, where your pointer is.
Hide floating mute. I'm not sure how to get that to go away.
Oh yeah, it's gone right now. Yeah.
Okay,
it should be
good.
fine right now. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay,
now,
good.
Let me hit play again. Now, is it still okay?
Yep, good. Yeah, there's something else there, but it doesn't affect your presentation. Yeah, let's go ahead.
Okay, I'm just going to do it from this view right here then.
Mm-hmm.
So why waterfalls? This is a question I get asked a lot. What's my infatuation with waterfalls? And besides the fact of the state that I happen to live in, I think that what makes waterfalls so intriguing is that they change constantly. So I think that, if you're into, outdoor and landscape photography, which you probably are if you're a part of this webinar, but everything in the landscape is changing. But whenever you have a landscape that has water running through it and running around it and near it, it's changing that much more rapidly. And I visit the same waterfalls a lot, being, I think I'm about 2.5 hours from the mountains, about 2 hours from the coast of North Carolina. So I'm in between mountains and the ocean. So I have the opportunity to drive in very short distances to a lot of these waterfalls. So I get to revisit them over and over again. And every time I go to these waterfalls, they're a little bit different. And not just because they're changing just the overall landscape, but because of the amount of water. And that's one of the things that really is fascinating about waterfalls, is that pretty much you're never going to get to a waterfall where the flow is exactly the same. It's so dependent on so many different variables. So how much rain happens to be present in that, the weeks or the months leading up to your visit. Or if you're in a colder climate and maybe you're in the springtime and maybe there's snow melt and that fuels these waterfalls. It's always changing. And the look of these waterfalls are so dependent on the amount of water. And this image right here on the left is a waterfall from Kauai. And the reason I have this up here, this is actually shot from a helicopter, and we're flying over, and the pilot is kind of radioing in, and I'm already nervous. I'm not a good flyer, let alone a helicopter. This is the only time I've ever been in a helicopter. There's no doors on this helicopter. My heart is just thumping, and I'm trying to take photos and not miss this opportunity. And the pilot, I don't even know what it's called. He radios in to the little headsets. And he says, Mark, look out your window, or look out the door to the left. Those waterfalls you see are never present. And I'm looking, and I barely see these waterfalls. And if you can see on the screen, they look just like tiny little streams, but they were fairly large waterfalls, but you only see these waterfalls under heavy, heavy rain. And I was actually visiting Kauai about a week after the major floods that they had in 2018. And it was just enough to show these waterfalls off. So I quickly put on a long lens to try and capture it. And this was actually the only image I was able to get that was sharp, because I was trembling so much, and the waterfall, or the helicopter, of course, was shaking. But that's just a really cool situation, or I should say example, of how without heavy water, this waterfall doesn't even exist. So it appears and it reappears at various times. And I think that's really cool. And the image on the right is an image from Oregon. And I've been told that this waterfall here very rarely flows anywhere close to this much. And once again, there was a lot of rain the week that I was there, and it was enough to fuel this waterfall right here. So the amount of water that's available completely changes the look of the actual waterfall. And on top of that, most waterfalls are usually in a woodland area. So whenever you have trees around, those are always going to be situations where they are very dependent on seasons. So you get fall colors, you get vibrant greens in the spring. So to make a long story short, there's a lot of things that change the overall look of an actual waterfall. So these are some of the things that really make me interested in the waterfalls, is because it's like a never-ending subject. It's always going to change. It's always going to be different. And I find that really intriguing. Now, as far as the actual camera gear, I think this is everybody's favorite topic, is camera gear. And the things that I use for waterfall photography, of course, a good sturdy tripod. And I find that funny. Whenever you hear people, especially photographers, talk about tripods, don't they always say a good sturdy tripod? And I do the same thing. I'm always saying a good sturdy tripod. And I always kind of stop myself. I'm like, Mark, why do you put the word sturdy in front of that? Because who's looking for a flimsy tripod? I've never heard anyone say, go out and find a very flexible tripod that's very weak and more than likely could break. Get that kind of a tripod. So I don't know, when I was preparing for this presentation, I kept saying a good sturdy tripod, and that just kind of jumped out at me. But you definitely want to have a sturdy tripod, mainly because the way that I photograph waterfalls is I always like to get in the water a little bit in a situation where it's at least safe. Sometimes I get down to maybe my ankles, sometimes my knees, but ultimately my tripod is always in the water. And with the waterfall, it's moving the water through the stream or the river, and that always creates a little bit of vibration in your tripod. And usually with waterfall photography, you have a little bit of a slower shutter speed. And we're going to dive all into this camera settings to use for waterfall photography. But a sturdy tripod to keep your camera as rock solid as possible is a good best practice to get into. And then I only use 2 lenses. I have a ultra wide angle lens and I have a long telephoto lens. Those are really the only lenses I bring for any type of a shoot, and especially for waterfall photography, mainly because, one, I don't have the best back in the world, so I try and keep the amount of gear that I use to an absolute minimum. But whenever you're shooting waterfall, things are usually going to be pretty wet. And we, start walking over little rocks and boulders, trying to get to certain locations where you might see a composition that's intriguing to you. Those rocks or stones or boulders are inevitably wet, covered in moss, covered in algae, aka they're very slippery. So having less gear on your back flopping around is definitely going to help you to keep that center of balance a little bit more stable for yourself. And it's ultimately going to result in a more pleasurable experience if you don't have to be completely petrified of traversing a couple rocks here and there. So I try and carry as little on my back as I possibly can. And then, of course, you need your camera. I shoot with a Fuji X-T3 for all of my stills and a Fuji X-T4 for all of my video work. Now, as far as the actual camera accessories are concerned, a shutter release, but I don't even use a shutter release. I put it on here, but I think what's most important is to have a way to trigger your camera without actually having to press the shutter button. So whenever you're using somewhat longer of an exposure, the last thing you want to do is have to actually press the shutter button, because that's always going to introduce a little bit of camera shake, which can inevitably make your images soft or a little bit out of focus or blurry. But I use a 2 or a 10-second self timer on my camera. And I do that for multiple reasons. One, it's free. Well, I guess it's not free. You have to pay for the camera, but you don't have to pay extra for a self timer. It's built into most cameras. It is not anything else that you have to carry around, and it's not something you have to plug in like a remote shutter. So that's kind of why I always use a self timer. But any way that you have to be able to start an exposure without pressing the shutter button is of the utmost importance. And then lens wipes. These are one of those things that is often overlooked. They're very inexpensive, a couple dollars for about 10 or 15 of them. But whenever you're photographing waterfalls, there's so much waterfall spray. I got it right that time. I always call it sea spray, but waterfall spray that inevitably gets all over your lens element and can absolutely destroy your photograph. I can't tell you how many times I capture an image I'm super excited about, drive all the way home, and I'm just thinking about the photograph. I can't wait to look at it on the screen. You get home and you pull it up, and then you spend the next 2 hours cloning out hundreds of water droplets. So keeping lens wipes handy. I always keep them stuffed in every pocket I possibly can, because I want to be able to get to them in my jackets or my pants as fast as possible and as often as possible to wipe off my lens element. And I actually gotten into a habit to where I wipe off the lens element before every single exposure. So if I do a 10-second timer, I'll go ahead and start that timer and wipe my lens for about 3 seconds and then pull it off and then take the exposure. And I find that that's usually a good best practice to ensure that you don't have water droplets all over the front of your lens. But a lot of lens wipes is something definitely that's good to bring along with you. And then water socks and water shoes. I use neoprene, I think they're called NRS boundary socks, and they're basically giant socks. I should have brought them up here so I could show you. But they're socks. They keep your feet, of course, dry. They also keep your feet warm. You can get in very, very cold water with these types of socks to keep your feet warm. You don't have to worry about them. And then I think I have some cheap, just kind of like water shoes. I got them from Walmart. They just kind of go over these water socks. But whatever solution you want to have that you can get your feet in the water a little bit, because a lot of times that's what's going to happen when you're shooting waterfalls, and you don't want to have to worry about cold feet or wet feet or anything like that. And then, of course, filters. Now, I don't use a ton of filters. The 2 filters that I do use, one is a solid neutral density filter. I have them all 10 stops, 6 stops, 3 stops, but I don't do a lot of super long exposure photography. Like I never photograph a waterfall with a 10-second or a 30-second or a minute long exposure, but every once in a while I will shoot with a 3-stop ND filter just to slow that shutter speed down just a little bit. And this is just an example. This is Dry Falls in North Carolina, which is I love the name. It's very ironic, but I did use a solid ND filter for this this image just to kind of slow it down just a little bit because there was a little bit of light, a fair amount of light coming through this canopy of trees. And then the other filter is a circular polarizer. And this, in my opinion, is the must-have filter for waterfall photography. And there's so many benefits of a circular polarizer, and it's kind of hard to explain. And I got some really good examples. The best way, in my opinion, to explain the effects of a circular polarizer is to just show you the difference. But it's ultimately fantastic at removing any type of glare or sheen or reflection off of a wet surface. And of course, when you're photographing waterfalls, everything around the waterfall is going to be wet. The stream is of course wet because it's water, and then the rocks. And something you don't think about is that waterfall spray kind of billows up in the air and it coats all the leaves around it in a thin layer of this water. And that water actually becomes reflective on the leaf, which creates this kind of sheen on all the leaves. And it also creates kind of an unmuting effect of all the colors as well. And here is a great example right here. So this is an image from last year in North Carolina. And as you can see, this is without a circular polarizer. And then here is the same exact image with the circular polarizer. And I'm going to kind of toggle this back and forth because I think that's the best way to see this is when you can kind of jump back and forth. So this is with the polarizer, and this is without the polarizer, with and without. And you can really see the difference of how it removes all of that reflective quality from all the leaves, all the rocks, all the surfaces, and it makes the greens really pop, especially if you look on the kind of this area right through here. You can see that reflection coming through, and then the circular polarizer cuts through all of that. And these are unedited photos, and you can just see what it does to all those greens. Here's another example right here without a circular polarizer and with. Without and with. So a circular polarizer is absolutely critical for waterfall photography. I use it on just about every single shoot. The only time I don't use it is when the sun is setting or rising and it's directly behind me, because that's kind of the situation where a circular polarizer isn't going to do anything for you. The way that it works the best is when the sun is above you and kind of maybe to the left or to the right of you, or ultimately like 90 degrees away from your camera. That's when you're going to get the maximum polarization effect. But circular polarizer is definitely a must-have piece of equipment in my own personal opinion. Now, as far as composition is concerned, so composition is one of those things. There's so much information out there on the topic of composition. I remember when I first got started with landscape photography, and most people don't know this about me because I never mention it, but I'm kind of a researcher. So I absolutely love researching things. And this sounds kind of weird, but I actually have met a few people who kind of share the same thought track that I do. But say when you're going to get a new camera, when I'm in the process of determining what new camera I want to purchase, I will research it to death. I mean, all day, all night for weeks, trying to figure out exactly, reading tons of reviews on whatever this new purchase is. And then when I make my buying decision and my product ships and it arrives, I almost feel let down because the research process is now over. And I love that process. And the only reason I tell that story is because when I got started with photography, I quickly realized that composition, that was going to be the way to improve my photography the most in the shortest amount of time. So I became absolutely obsessed with all things related to composition. Read everything, watched it all. I listened to every podcast I could find all about composition. And you can really kind of muddy your brain up a lot when you start figuring out all these different types of or tips and tricks and best practices, compositional tools that you can apply when you're on location. And that's exactly what happened to me. I consumed so much information that when I'd get on location, I couldn't get out of my own way because I was trying to apply every single thing that I learned. And I actually saw the composition, or my compositional skills, start to decrease. So I started to realize that I need to keep things simple. And as we go through these next few slides, you'll definitely kind of see that my simplistic nature with composition, but it really helps me out to kind of think about things like this. This photograph right here, by the way, is another image from that same helicopter flight. The pilot radios in, Mark, look to the left. There's a waterfall, or a rainbow appearing over that waterfall. So I have the long lens on again. Of course, I'm having an anxiety attack up there, trying to capture these images. And once again, this is the only version of this photograph I was able to capture that was perfectly sharp. But I do love the image, and the rainbow does it all for this one. Now, as far as composition is concerned, one of my favorite kind of tips or best practices that I use whenever I'm photographing waterfalls is to do something called getting low to the flow, which ultimately means just getting the camera, getting the tripod in the water, getting the camera as close to the water as you safely can without it getting completely drenched, but to where you can get those kind of immersive images where the waterfall flow is actually coming towards the camera. And it looks so cool with the water just kind of pouring right into the lens is what it looks like. Of course, don't actually let that happen. And please make sure you're always very safe whenever you are getting into the water. But getting low to the flow is a great way to create those immersive photographs, and utilizing the outflow of the waterfall as a leading line to draw the viewer's eye, to draw the viewer's attention up into the photograph. Foreground interest in leading lines is sometimes difficult with waterfall photography because usually the center of the waterfall is going to be consumed by the actual outflow or the river or stream that is a result of the waterfall. And a lot of times the interest is beneath the water, all the rocks and the stones. So you got to get a little bit creative looking for foreground, but getting low to the flow and getting close to the outflow of that waterfall is something that I love the way that that looks. And it's just something that I'm always thinking about whenever I get on location for waterfalls. Now, supporting elements. Now, this does not only focus on waterfall photography. I do this with all types of outdoor photography, regardless of what my subject happens to be. And it's basically when you get to the location, and I know we've all heard this 100 times, and you don't pull out your camera immediately, don't whip out the tripod and start trying to set up a composition. You want to kind of get there and feel the area out a little bit. And I kind of go with the notion that photography, it's not all about the photograph. It's about the journey. It's about the process. It's about everything that leads up to the shoot itself. And the photograph is kind of like your trophy. It's your keeper. It's your keepsake or your memory of that trip or of that day to that specific location. So I try and enjoy my time as much as possible when I get on location, but a lot of times I will get on location and you kind of get what do you call it, like sensory overload a little bit. You get really excited. Maybe the sun, the clouds are exploding with color, or there's fog rolling in, or whatever the case may be, and you get a little bit anxious and you start just kind of jumping into photographer mode. But I always try to just kind of put my bag down, sit down, relax a little bit. More than likely, you'd probably hike to your waterfall or wherever your location was, drink a little bit of water or coffee or tea or whatever you happen to bring with you, and just kind of survey the scene. And ask yourself, what do you love about the scene? What are the supporting elements? Why do you want to photograph this waterfall? And in this particular instance, I love the kind of the peak of the waterfall up here. It was a very unique looking waterfall. It's something that I've never seen before, and it had a very kind of otherworldly quality to it. So that was one of the main supporting elements for me. I love this kind of outflow right here. I love this green area right through here where this kind of angling up, pointing towards the waterfall. I love this little tree on the right-hand side because it kind of balanced out the image. But wherever you are, just taking a few moments and just kind of surveying the scene and looking for those supporting elements. And it really does help you to create your composition. Because when you figure out what your supporting elements are, and you don't have to come up with 15 or 20 of your favorite qualities, I'm always looking for maybe 3 or 4 things in this scene that really excites me. And I like to think of those 3 or 4 things as kind of like pieces to a puzzle. And the pieces to this puzzle you're ultimately going to put together, and that's going to be your composition. But identifying what those pieces are is really going to help you out. Now, and here's just another example right here where this log was one of the main supporting elements of this scene. I absolutely loved how I could get really, really close to this log with a very wide angle lens, and it really exaggerated it. I mean, it was a big log anyway, but it looks a lot larger in this photograph than it actually was. But I love the crisscrossing nature of the logs, where it happened to be, and how the log was just kind of directing the viewer's eye up and around, but just identifying what all those supporting elements are. And that's the very first thing I would recommend doing whenever you get on any shoot, but especially a waterfall location as well. Now, this is a big one when it comes to specifically waterfalls and its distractions. And I know we mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that a lot of times waterfalls are located in woodland areas. And these woodland areas are obviously, they have trees, and trees inevitably fall. So it's very, very common to encounter a waterfall that's got a fallen tree somewhere in the scene. And you got to kind of navigate those a little bit. A lot of times these logs will destroy a photograph. And this image right here is a perfect example of it. This is a raw photo. This hasn't been edited at all, but this is actually my favorite composition of this waterfall here. But you know, I love these leaves right through here. I loved how the outflow of the waterfall was going beneath this rock or this log right here, because it adds some additional depth to the overall photograph. But this log right here, it's a freshly fallen log, and it is just such an eyesore. There's nothing photogenic about that log. So you're going to find situations where you're going to have to navigate these, and fallen trees and logs are not going to be the only distraction you have to account for. But whatever they are, definitely kind of survey the scene, look for those distractions, and you're going to have to kind of position your composition to where you can minimize those types of distractions. And I think this is a good example right here, where you can still see that log in the left-hand side, but you can no longer see that front portion of the log that was so bright, that kind of a freshly fallen wood color. So I think that's just a good example of just kind of surveying the scene, figuring out what you love about the photograph, figuring out what the distractions are, and how best you can eliminate those. And sticking with the theme of distractions, the empty sky. So if you ever go back and look at any of your past waterfall shots, you'll probably have a lot of images where if you look at the top of the waterfall, you've got kind of like this V-shaped area where it's the sky. And that sky generally is kind of bland because it's just a little portion of the sky. I mean, every once in a while, you could get very lucky and get a colorful sunrise or sunset, but more than likely, it's not going to be something that's going to add to your overall photograph. So it's something to keep in mind. Now, in this particular image, I wanted to keep the sky in it because there was fog actually kind of just nestled into this kind of canyon area. And of course, I didn't want to cut off the top of this waterfall because I think it's one of the best features of this actual waterfall is the top of it. But it's something that you always want to think about whenever you're composing a waterfall shot is what are you going to do with that empty sky? And one of the most common things to do is to just cut off the very top of the waterfall and just capture the actual water cascading down. But it's just something to keep in mind. I've never found a real kind of best practice that'll apply to all situations because all waterfalls are, of course, very different. But it's just good, something good to keep in mind as to what you might have to contend with when you're having to deal with that kind of empty sky at the very top of the waterfall. Now, storytelling, and this is something that I think is very important, not only in photography, but really any kind of art. And being able to get the viewer, the person that's looking at some of your photographs, to getting them to feel something or to invoke some type of emotion by looking at your photograph is very, very, very powerful. And it's something that I always think about when I'm on location, as well as kind of taking a mental survey of the overall scene and asking myself, you know, what am I feeling when I'm on location here? You know, what is the environment? And a lot of times just taking that quick kind of mental headset check, if you will, really helps you to compose a photograph. So in this particular image, I think it's a great example of this. If you remove the fact that this was fall, I don't think this image works at all. So if you were to take all these fall leaves off the rocks in the foreground, and if you were to either take all the leaves off the tree, maybe it was in winter, or if this is in summer and all the leaves were just green, I just don't think that this image would work as well. But the contrasting colors between the rocks in the foreground and the autumn leaves that are sitting on top of them, to me, are everything. I love the triangular shapes of all the rocks in the foreground too that are kind of pointing into the image. But when you look at this photograph, I wanted the viewer to feel that autumn feel. I wanted them to feel that crisp air. And it sounds kind of weird, but when you're on location, if you think about what could this composition make somebody feel or think, or how can you invoke the emotion that you might be feeling when you're on location at that particular spot, I think that's a very powerful thing to think about. And you can't always create that. But I think that if you just make it a point to try and figure out a way that you can accurately convey what you're feeling in that particular moment with the environment into your image, I think that's a very powerful thing. And then intimate details. And this is something that I also do. This isn't only about waterfalls, but I do this in all of my my outdoor shoots, is that I try and create a storyboard. And that storyboard contains 3 images. And the very first image, of course, is that wide angle shot. It's going to be the wide angle shot of the waterfall, capturing everything in its totality. And then the next image is going to be an intimate, detailed shot that I get with a longer focal length. And I love to zoom into the base of the waterfall and kind of get those crashing water images. I love that. A lot of times, if you get that kind of waterfall spray that kind of sweeps around and you get that kind of circular motion, I think that's just absolutely the best. But the second image is always that intimate, detailed shot. And then the third image is something in between. I don't own a mid-range zoom, but it could be the longer focal length of my wide angle lens, or maybe the shorter focal length of my telephoto lens, but whatever it is. But just to get a storyboard of your location, so your wide shot, your telephoto shot, and then something in between there. And I think that's a great way to tell the story. And this also kind of goes back to storytelling. And I think that waterfall photography is very synonymous with wide angle lenses, because a lot of times you got to get close to a waterfall and you got to use a wide angle lens to do that. But picking off those intimate details is a ton of fun to do, mainly because there's so many little vignettes inside of a waterfall that you can create an image out of. Plus, it's so much easier to compose a telephoto shot, in my personal opinion, than a wide angle shot, mainly because with a telephoto lens, you don't have as much stuff to put in your scene, or you don't have as much stuff, I should say, to arrange in your overall photograph like you do a wide angle lens, because a wide angle lens is obviously a very wide focal length, and you've got all kinds of things it's capturing, and you have to figure out a way to organize these things in your composition in the most appealing way possible. But zooming in and picking up those intimate details is an absolute blast to do, and I love it. It's one of my favorite things about waterfall photography. But those are kind of the things that I think about when it comes to composition, and those really help me to compose a photograph whenever I'm photographing moving water, and especially waterfalls. Now, camera settings, and this is something that I get asked a lot of questions about, what are the best camera settings for waterfall photography? And it's, in my opinion, it's kind of an impossible question. It depends on so many different variables, but I'm going to definitely do my best to answer the question here. And you'll have to forgive me, but if you see the title of this slide, it says the end in mind, and it's kind of a carryover from my days in the corporate world. It's a very salesy term, the end in mind, but I think it very much applies to photography. And what it means to me is that before you ever even pull out your camera, before you even think about camera settings or determine your composition, just kind of asking yourself what your end goal is with this particular composition or this particular location. What do you envision your waterfall to look like? What's the feeling you want to convey? And all that does is just kind of gets those creative juices flowing a little bit and helps you to understand exactly what type of camera settings you want to dial in, or what type of composition you want to go with. And this is going to make a little bit more sense here in just a moment, but thinking about what the end in mind is, and going through that kind of purposeful exercise and making yourself think, all right, Mark, what do I want to do with this waterfall? And just kind of thinking about that's really going to help you to figure out exactly the camera settings you want to dial in and the overall composition that you want to go with. But in my personal opinion, the most important camera setting for waterfall photography is shutter speed. Shutter speed is king. It is hands down the most important camera setting that you have to dial in for various different reasons. The first reason is that a slow shutter speed is going to tell a completely different story than a fast shutter speed is. You'll probably start to see a little bit of a trend throughout this entire presentation about kind of storytelling and how your photographs can tell a story, invoke emotion or feelings in the viewer, which I think is just the absolute grand slam. But if you look at this photograph, this is that same image that we looked at earlier in the presentation, but this of course is a slower shutter speed. And if you look at this image, it's got a very calm look. It's got a very quiet look, ethereal, and a very peaceful feeling. And those are the feelings that I get. Those are the emotions that I get when I look at images like this that have that slower shutter speed associated with it. Just a very peaceful feeling. And on the flip side of that, you have a fast shutter speed. This is a Yosemite Valley or Yosemite Falls in Yosemite. And just zooming in with the long lens, capturing the waterfall crashing below. And I love all the kind of dappled light, very interesting and dynamic light. But I wanted to use a fast shutter speed here. This was in April, and I think two Aprils ago, a lot of that glacier melt. The waterfalls were absolutely raging when I was there. Very, very powerful. And it was a great opportunity to show that power by using a fast shutter speed. So whenever you're using a fast shutter speed, that creates that kind of a grandiose feeling of the waterfalls. It creates kind of an emotion of adventure, of excitement. It creates a high dynamic photograph, a powerful image. So it's a completely different feeling than the slow shutter speed. Here's just another couple examples. This is actually Bridal Veil Falls, same trip in Yosemite. Images just captured with a very fast shutter speed to freeze that water, to show the powerful nature of these images. And I think this is a fantastic example right here. Same exact composition from Oregon, same exact everything except the shutter speed. And the image on the left shot with 1/60th of a second, and the image on the right shot at a 2-second exposure. And they look completely different. I personally like the slower shutter speed version of this image. The one on the left just doesn't do it for me, but you can just see how totally different this image looks. And the only thing that changed is the camera settings, the shutter speed. So definitely think about that whenever you're dialing in your camera settings. And this is another fantastic example. The image on the left, 1/200th of a second, image on the right, 1/2 second exposure, in a completely different image. The image on the left definitely feels much more powerful, much more energetic. And the image on the right seems very peaceful, very quiet and simplistic image. So I think shutter speed is the king when it comes to dialing in camera settings, is the most important thing to go for. And my favorite shutter speed is actually kind of a blend. I call it a blended shutter speed because it's not always super fast, it's not super slow. It's kind of something in the middle, but my ultimate goal is to always create, or I should say, always show that the water is moving. I want to show a little bit of motion, but I also want to have a fast enough shutter speed to where it retains a lot of detail, because I want to see the detail in the moving water. A lot of times, and it's one of the main reasons I don't do super long exposures, because I find, this is just personal preference, but I find that a lot of those images almost kind of look like milk. It's just kind of flowing over. And a lot of people love those images. I personally like to see a little bit more detail in the overall water. So I kind of go for this blended shutter speed look. And here's another good example right here where you can definitely see that that water is moving, but you can also see that there's still a ton of detail. And if I shot this with, say, a 5 or a 10-second exposure, it would have lost all the detail in the water. Now, it takes a lot of trial and error when you're on location to figure out exactly what shutter speed to go for, because it's so dependent on the flow of the actual water. So if you're using a a 1 second exposure when it's an absolutely raging river or raging waterfall. And you use that same 1 second exposure. If that same waterfall is just a little bit of a trickle, it's going to completely change the overall look. So it's very dependent on the amount of water that happens to be flowing. So what I would always recommend doing is, most of us, we're not shooting film, we're all shooting digital. So sky's the limit with how many images we can take. So take images that are a slow shutter speed, take a few images that are going to freeze the action, and also take a few images that are kind of this blended shutter speed. That way, when you get back home, get back in post, you can figure out which ones you want to edit. You can figure out which ones look the best. And maybe you edit all 3 versions. You have a nice slow shutter speed, a fast shutter speed, creating that kind of powerful image. And then you can also have a blended shutter speed like this image right here, but just having a variation when you get back home in your editing suite, I think it's definitely a good best practice to get into. Now, as far as aperture is concerned, I'm usually somewhere between f8 and f11 with waterfall photography because I always want to get everything in focus. I very rarely am ever comfortable with having the foreground perfectly sharp and maybe having the background slowly fall out of focus. I usually want to get everything in perfect focus throughout the entire image. So I'm usually somewhere between f8 and f11. And then as far as ISO comes into play, I like to think of ISO as SSS, which is shutter speed support. And what I mean by that is, I think the last thing you'd want to do, let's say you're on location and you've determined that the perfect shutter speed for the waterfall that you're photographing is 1/25 of a second. Say you've picked your aperture of f11, and let's say you look at your light meter and it says it's 1 stop underexposed, which is a very common situation because a lot of times waterfalls are in woodland areas, and woodland areas a lot of times can be a little bit dimmer lit situations. There's not always a ton of ambient light. So it's not unusual to have your image be a little bit underexposed. Now, the last thing you'd want to do in that scenario is start to fuss around with your shutter speed, maybe to drag out your shutter speed a little bit longer, to introduce a little bit more light, to create a more balanced exposure. Because yeah, maybe the exposure will be a little bit better, but now you've changed your shutter speed, and that's going to completely change your overall photograph. And since shutter speed is the most important thing, I always lean on ISO, or the shutter speed support, because that's kind of what I think of it as. Because the ISO's job is to help me create that perfectly exposed image while at the same time retaining the shutter speed that I selected. So I have no problem bumping my ISO up to 640 is usually around the threshold I like to go, but you can go even a little bit higher. Cameras are so good nowadays that you're not going to really see any noise in your photographs by going up to around 640 or maybe even a little bit higher, unless you just really pixel peep and zoom all the way in. But for the most part, you've got a lot of latitude there where you can kind of bump up that ISO to enable you to keep the shutter speed in the aperture that you want. So I hope that made sense. I was getting a little bit technical there, but ultimately, I think the last thing you want to do is start to mess around with your shutter speed in order to try and correct your exposure. That's where you really want to lean on your ISO to do that. And as far as post-processing is concerned, now, I absolutely love post-processing. I kind of go back and forth on what's my favorite aspect of photography. Is it actually being on location and taking the photograph? Is it planning the trips? Or is it the actual post-processing aspect of it? I really love the entire component from start to finish, but the post-processing, I feel like, is the time where you can really bring your image to life. And I got a couple images that I want to walk you through real quick. And I got a real cool kind of trick at the very end that solves a really big problem with waterfall photography, but I got a really cool trick that anybody can do. It's real simple, and I'll show you that as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and I'm going to share Lightroom. Let's see, share. All right. If you cannot see Lightroom, somebody let me know, but I think you should be able to. So this is the a final edited version. This is just a small little waterfall. I guess you'd call it a creek or a babbling brook. Nothing too fantastic about this image, but here is the actual raw file right here. So a pretty big transformation. And one of the things that I like to do with all of my waterfall photography. Let me just come up here. Let's just kind of correct a lot of this stuff. Let's just kind of bring the exposure up a touch, just watching the histogram here, because a lot of that's piled up on the left. I want to start to shift some of that to the right here. We bring the highlights down a little bit. And if you notice that there's still a fair amount of detail in the water right through here, but there's not quite as much, not enough for me. I definitely want to bring out more. And one of the easiest ways to do that is just by reducing the highlights. And you can see how much detail is coming into the water when I do that. But now that water kind of loses that white color, and it becomes very dark, and it becomes kind of gray. So you really want to be careful with the amount of highlight recovery that you apply. But I like to bring that down a little bit, because it's definitely going to bring out a lot of that detail. Kind of boost the shadows up just a touch here. And I'm going to bring the whites up a little bit, because that's going to bring out some of that the white in the actual water that we lost when we were reducing our highlights right through here. Grab a little bit of water. I hope you all are enjoying this so far. I know that I'm definitely, I keep looking at the clock here to make sure that I'm not running over, because this is one of those topics I feel like I could talk about for hours. So I'm trying to make sure I pack as much information into this 90-minute webinar just to maximize everybody's time as I possibly can. But and in the blacks, I'm gonna, a lot of times I'll kind of bring the blacks up a little bit, just kind of fade them just a little bit. Now, one of the things that I think that this particular image is lacking, and I find this is kind of a common case, there's a very specific reason why I chose this image to edit, is because that it lacks any kind of dynamic light. And something that I like to do is come up here and grab the radio filter and just draw a huge kind of radius right across the top area right here. I hit the shortcut key O just so you can see exactly where this filter is. Kind of bring it down a little bit there. I'm going to turn that mask overlay off. And let's kind of increase this exposure some. I'm going to warm it up a little bit, because I'm just trying to kind of exaggerate the look, or create the look, I should say, of sunlight kind of coming through here. I'm going to add a little bit of negative dehaze, because you can see how that kind of softens that area up there at the top. Kind of bring that there. I'm actually going to warm this up even more. You can see what that's doing there. Somewhere maybe around there looks good. And if I toggle this on and off, that's before and after, before and after. And that just makes a massive difference. And it adds a little bit more depth in the overall photograph. And the viewer's eye, or I should say the human eye, always gravitates towards the brightest part of the scene. So whenever you look at a photograph, your eye is immediately going to look at the brightest portion of the scene. And if that brightest portion of the photograph is in the backhand portion of the image, that's just a great way to get the viewer to kind of walk their eye all the way through the overall image. And I think it's something that was really lacking in this overall photograph. So this is where it started here, and this is where we're at right now. So now that there's a little bit of interest coming through here in the backhand side, I want to really exaggerate a lot of this water coming through and bringing out a lot of that detail. And I like to do that with an adjustment brush. So I'm going to hit the shortcut key O just so you can see where I'm painting. And I'm just going to loosely paint all around here, wherever this kind of whitewash is. And as you can tell, I'm not getting super, particular of where I'm painting. I'm just kind of covering it all right through here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to range mask, and I'm going to select luminance range mask. I'm going to hit show luminance mask. And as you can see, everything in red right now is going to receive that edit, or whatever edit I decide to apply to this. And as I start to drag this to the right, you'll see that mask starts to get a little bit more refined. You can actually see it a little bit better if I hold down the option key like this. So this is the way it started. If I drag this over, you can see that that mask gets a little bit more refined. I'm going to drag this a little bit, the smoothness slider over. And I think something about right there looks good. And now when that mask is targeted, now I can increase the exposure and kind of bring out some of that white. And I can bring down the highlights, bring up the exposure a little bit, maybe even bring up the whites a little bit here. I think I'm going to bring the exposure down and bring the whites up. Let's toggle this on and off. I love on and off because that tells me what I'm actually doing, because a lot of times when you start moving sliders here and there and adjusting filters, it gets kind of hard to see where the edit began and where the edit currently sits. So I'm always flipping between on and off, before and after. And then I always love to add some contrast, because that's going to add some definition. If I kind of go back and forth here, you can see what that's doing to the overall water. So maybe about right there. I think I'm going to bring the exposure down just a touch as well. You can even add a little bit of clarity, but you definitely want to be careful with that, because if you turn up clarity all the way, it kind of starts to look a little bit too bitey, a little bit too crunchy, and you definitely don't want that. Water's flowing, water's soft. So, but I think that adding a little bit of clarity, there's not a whole lot wrong with that. Sometimes I do negative clarity. Sometimes I'll add a little bit, just because clarity is great for adding structure and creating body to things. Now, if I toggle this on and off, that's before and after. I'm going to bring the highlights down just a little bit more. So that's just a real quick edit, a great way to bring out a little bit of detail in the overall water. And then I also will almost always kind of dodge and burn waterfall images as well, because a lot of times that you'll get dappled light, because waterfalls are usually in woodland area, and you get kind of little puddles of light here and there, and exemplifying, or I should say that, not exemplifying, exaggerating these puddles of light can really kind of complexify or create a very dynamic lighting condition. And it's so simple to do too. I'm just going to create a quick radial filter here. Let's just kind of drag it over here, because there's light naturally hitting this area. Kind of turn this to the right like that. Hit the shortcut key O. I think that looks good. This is really fun too. Let's add a range mask to this. Luminance range mask. I'm going to hold down the Option key. Anything that's in white is going to receive the edit, and anything in black is not. So you can see this is the way that radial filter originally looked. And when I start to drag this slider over, you can see how targeted that's going to get. I think something like that looks good there. Let's boost the exposure up some. Maybe even add a little bit of warmth to create that illusion or exaggerate that look of sunlight hitting it. This is before and after. That made a huge difference. And then what's really cool is we can just duplicate this, and we can just drag it over here. And if I hit the shortcut key O again, it keeps that same mask. So like if I take it over here, that same mask exists. So I think I'm just going to do that right there. I think that looks good. Duplicate it again. Maybe we can drag this one maybe to this region over here. We could do the same thing, duplicate, maybe drag this one over here. And I'm just doing this really quick in the essence of time, but I want to make sure you get the idea. And we can turn these on and off. And if you just look at these areas that we put these radial filters on, that's off and on, off and on. I see one more area I just got to do. Drag this one over here, a little bit of light, kind of hitting that area right through there. And you can sit here, it's really easy to go completely overboard on these two, just creating tons of radial filters, because it's a ton of fun to do, just looking for areas where the light is just naturally hitting certain areas or the tops of rocks, and putting a radial filter on there just to kind of exaggerate it just a little bit more. And I can turn this off, and let's toggle the entire edit on and off. So this is before and after, before and after. So that's kind of a real quick walkthrough. One thing I didn't do in here is add any contrast to this overall image. Something like that. Probably, maybe that looks good. Or maybe using the tone curve. And then I always add a vignette to all of my photographs, just to kind of create that focused image. I'm always trying to darken down the corners of all of my photographs, because I really don't want the viewer's eye to linger around the corners of my images. I really want to draw the viewer's eye into the center of my photograph, because I think that the longer you have the viewer paying attention to the center of your image, the longer they're probably going to spend looking at your overall photograph. So I always try to keep their eyes away from the edges of the scene, kind of draw their eye into the center of the photograph. But that's just a real quick example of how I edit the water, how I edit certain types of lighting conditions, or trying to create certain types of lighting conditions for my waterfall photos. So I definitely hope that was helpful. And then I'm going to hit stop sharing one more time. And I want to show you that trick that I was mentioning, because let's see here. Share screen. All right, so you should be able to see Photoshop now. So this is a very common issue with waterfall photography. So this is an image right here. We saw this in the overall slideshow, and I should say in the slideshow earlier. And this was the image. I forgot exactly how long it was. Maybe this was the 2-second or maybe the half-second exposure, but whatever the case may be, it looks fantastic when you look at it right now. But when you zoom in, you'll notice that all of these leaves, you zoom all the way in here, you can see how blurry they all are. Whoa, zoomed in way too far. And that's a very common issue with waterfall photography, because a lot of times that water, the falling water, creates wind. So whenever there's the wind is around leaves, those leaves are going to be blowing. So if you try and have a slower shutter speed, you're going to get these blurry leaves. So the easy thing to try and do is just speed up that shutter speed to resolve that issue. So we could come up here, and this is that same issue here, or the same photograph, but with a much quicker shutter speed to kind of freeze those leaves, because we don't want blurry leaves in our photo. And that, if you look at this right here, whoops, you'll notice that all of these leaves here are all tack sharp. No movement at all in these, whoops. But now the waterfall is not the shutter speed that we're looking for. And this is kind of the issue that you get into a lot of times with waterfall photography, is you might want to have a little bit slower shutter speed, but you're going to get blurry leaves unless it's a perfectly still day, which in my experience doesn't happen too often in waterfall photography. There's almost always a little bit of breeze that's going to blow those leaves around. So what do you do? And you don't have to be a Photoshop wizard or Jedi or anything to do this trick. It's very, very simple, and it's very quick. And I'll walk you through the entire process, which is really short right now. So the first thing to do is just to capture both images. So we mentioned this earlier about capturing slower shutter speeds, also capturing a little bit faster shutter speed. Just that way you have everything. When you get back home, you have all of the data or all the multiple versions of these photographs to look over. So what I am going to do, this image right here, this is the slower shutter speed. So I'm just going to call this one slow shutter speed. And in this image right here, let's just call this one the, let's call this one the fast shutter speed. Actually, I don't even need to do that because I know exactly what that is. But I wonder why it's not letting me name these. Here, I just need to really name one of them, slow. All right, so we have the slow shutter speed on the bottom. We have the fast shutter speed on the top. And all that you do, because we ultimately want to keep all of this image right here, because this is the image shot with the faster shutter speed with all of the leaves frozen, but we want to get that waterfall that has the slow shutter speed to come through. So all that I'm going to do is just going to hit this little button right here, and I'm going to create a layer mask. And white reveals and black conceals. So if I grab a paintbrush, which I have right now, I'm going to use a soft edge, which is right there. I want to make sure that I have black highlighted, and I'm going to paint on this actual waterfall. Make sure you have the opacity at 100. I'm going to have the flow at 100 as well. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit, and I'm going to start painting on this top layer right here. And as you can see, as soon as I paint in here, you can see that it's bringing through the other image, which is the slow waterfall. And if you look at the actual layer mask right here, you can see that black stripe right through there. And that's the actual waterfall coming through the slower shutter speed layer right through here. I'm actually going to paint all through here. You don't really have to get too technical with any of this, just like this. The most important thing is to not move your tripod at all whenever you are shooting the two images. And there it is. Get a little bit up here at the top, a little bit down there, and that was it. And that's exactly how I created that image that I showed earlier. And so that was two images blended together, two shutter speeds blended together. And if I turn this layer off, you'll see that this is a slower shutter speed showing below with the blurry leaves. And now I have the leaves that are perfectly sharp. Zoom in here. And I actually have the waterfall that has the shutter speed that I like. So that's just a real quick tip of how to kind of alleviate that issue, because it's a very, very common problem with waterfall photography. And I can't tell you how many times I tried to figure out exactly how to do that. And then somebody showed me one day how to blend those together. And it was like one of those aha or light bulb moments for me when I was really surprised by how easy it actually was to kind of blend those two shutter speeds together. So it was a lot of fun, and it really opened up a lot of doors for me, because you can use this technique in, I should say that you'll find many, many situations where this type of a technique could come in extremely handy when you want to blend multiple shutter speeds together. So that's just a real quick tip. Like I mentioned, you don't have to be a Photoshop wizard to implement that, but it's something that is a real game changer I found in my own waterfall photography. So I do hope that those two kind of post-processing kind of tips and tricks, which kind of gives you an idea exactly how I go about it, how I think about editing my waterfall photos. And I also hope that a lot of the information contained in the presentation is some things that you can think about, maybe potentially a different way to think about composition or the camera settings that you want to dial in the next time you're on location to shoot waterfalls. So I'm going to stop the sharing now, and I'm hoping that there is a ton of questions that people have that we can go through. I find that the question and answer portion is the time where so much of the best discussion actually comes from. So I want to make sure that I save some time for that.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Thank you, Mark, for your wonderful presentation. Yeah, we have tons of questions in the chat room and on the YouTube. Yeah, I think we have like 76 questions, so you're going to stay here for the rest of the night.
Oh, perfect. I'll be up all night. I need more coffee.
Okay. Okay. So question from Brian. So he is asking about the recommendations of the waterfall in North Carolina.
Oh, I would definitely recommend Dry Falls is absolutely fantastic. Chattooga Falls is great. There's actually, if you Google, I think it's just best North Carolina waterfalls, and hit the very first website that pops up. And I forgot the gentleman's name who wrote the waterfall guide, but it lists all of them. And it's an absolutely wealth of information. It tells you how to get to all the waterfalls, what they look like. And it's a best place to go to get all the information, because we could sit here for an hour talking about North Carolina waterfalls. But yeah, check that out for sure.
Okay, and question from Angie. When using both the ND and circular polarizer, which do you put on the camera first?
So that's a very good question. I usually will put the ND filter on first, and then I will put the circular polarizer on. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. Normally I'll put the circular polarizer closest to the lens, and then I will put the ND filter in front of the circular polarizer.
Yeah. If you are using the NiSi holder, the polarizers on the holder. So
right. Yeah, and it's got like little slots. I should have had that ready too, where you slide in the graduated or the solid ND filter, but it always goes right in front of the circular polarizer.
Yeah. Okay. So there are two questions about shooting tips for in the winter time. So how do you get the correct exposure when you're shooting in the winters to avoid the overexposing the snow?
Okay, yeah, that's a very good question. So I find that snow kind of really, I guess, wreaks havoc a little bit on a camera's metering system, because it always thinks that snow is brighter than it actually is. So a lot of times, if you solely rely on your camera's metering system and you're kind of in the habit of determining where your proper exposure is based off of if the light meter stops at 0 or right around 0, when you get those images in post, you'll realize that a lot of those images are underexposed, and it's because your camera thinks that snow is brighter than it really is. So a good best practice to get into is always to overexpose your snow a little bit when you're on location. So make it look a little bit brighter than it really is. So maybe one stop overexposed, maybe a stop and a half. But and I would also recommend taking a couple variations of that. So maybe take a version that's a half stop overexposed, maybe one stop overexposed. But that's going to help you to get properly exposed snow, and it's also going to help you to get away from that blue-looking snow that sometimes underexposed snow looks like. I don't know why that was so hard for me to say.
Okay. Question from Karin. So with so many streams coming down, how do you decide what is the actual subject and what to focus on? For example, the slide number 18.
Okay, so let me go to slide 18 here. I got another monitor here. Oh, as far as what to focus on?
Yeah, what to focus on.
So for me, it goes in kind of hand in hand with what the supporting elements are, or asking yourself, what do you love about the actual photograph? Because, or I should say about the waterfall, because that's going to tell you what you want to put in your scene. And, you know, I could be standing next to the same waterfall as you are, and we could be standing right there, and I could write down what I love about the waterfall, and then you could write down what you love about the waterfall. If we compare those two notes, there's a good chance that we're both going to love different things about that waterfall. So, but those are going to be your list of supporting elements, and those are going to be the things that you want to focus on, and those are going to be the key components of your composition, or the puzzle pieces to your puzzle. So I would just say, when you get to a waterfall, take a few minutes, relax, and just stare at it, and enjoy the environment, and really think about what you love most about it, because that's going to tell you what you want to photograph.
Mm-hmm. And there are a few questions about the gears. Bob asks, is your Fujifilm's full frame, and how wide is your lens?
So I have the Fuji X-T4 and X-T3, which are both crop APS-C sensor cameras, so not full frame. But my widest lens is the Fujifilm 8 to 16 millimeter 2.8, which is an absolutely tremendous lens. And I believe that's a full frame equivalent of a 12 to 24, which makes it an ultra wide angle lens.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, the follow-up question from Peyton's, how do you choose the lens that you went with?
For waterfall photography, or the lens that I purchased? Or does it say?
No, he didn't mention it, but I guess it's about a waterfall.
Yeah. So I always try and use both lenses. So I only have the wide angle lens and a long telephoto lens, and I will always try and use both when I'm on location to kind of create multiple versions of that waterfall. Because when I first got into landscape photography, I would spend hours at a waterfall, and I'd come home with one composition taken about 187 different times, over and over and over and over again. And then I would pick the very best one, and that'd be the one that I edit, and that'd be my keeper. So I spent hours to come up with one image, and I no longer do that anymore. So I try and really maximize my time at a location. And I think the best way to do that is by getting a variation of compositions. And the best way to do that is by using different focal lengths. So I'll always capture those wide angle images, and I'll also capture kind of longer telephoto shots to get those kind of intimate details. And zooming in on crashing water, so the base of the waterfall, is almost the guarantee home run. You are always going to get a cool photograph by utilizing that, especially with a faster shutter speed.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Andrew asks, any regret switching to the crop sensor body?
No. And the main reason why is because I don't shoot a whole lot of astro, and I don't really, it's really one of the main reasons why I stopped using a full frame camera, is because I don't think that I was using it to its fullest capability, because I didn't really need that massive amount of light collecting power that a full frame sensor has. But I've had no issues at all with my Fuji cameras. I honestly haven't even noticed a difference, to be honest with you. But no regrets at all.
Okay, question from Brian. Do you shoot in shutter priority or manual?
Always manual. But if I were to not shoot in manual mode for a waterfall shot, it would be shutter speed priority, because shutter speed is king. It is the most important thing for me. So I definitely would want to make sure that my camera knows that I want to take control over the shutter speed. So I would definitely want to shoot in shutter speed priority. But I always use manual mode. And if you're not comfortable with manual mode yet, I would definitely try and get comfortable with it, because it unlocks a whole new world of power in your camera when you have control over all of it. Plus, I think it's a lot of fun when you control every aspect of it.
Yep, M for master.
Yeah.
Okay.
Not that I'm a control freak or anything, but I like to control everything related to the camera.
Okay, and GS, do you focus stack your waterfall image?
Yeah, I do focus stack waterfall images. You got to be a little bit careful sometimes, because whenever there's anything moving in your scene and you're focus stacking it, sometimes that stitching can get a little wonky sometimes. But I often will focus stack. It really just depends on how close the nearest object is to my lens. If it's within, 3, 4, 5 feet, a lot of times I'll have to focus stack that, but I do that quite a bit.
Yeah, there are two questions about a few questions about the shutter speed blending. I think that refer to do you blend the slow shutter speed of and fast shutter speed for the water, not about the shaky tree.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, I call it a blended shutter speed. I actually should probably think of a different term for that, because I used that term in a video before, and I think it confused people before. But when I say blended shutter speed, it's just basically saying it's not a real fast shutter speed and it's not a real slow shutter speed. It's just something kind of in between. And I determine what that blended shutter speed is going to be just based off of just a lot of trial and error when you're on location, because it's so dependent on the flow of water. So I just get on location and I just start taking image after image with different shutter speeds, maybe 1/15th of a second, 1/25th, 1/50th, and then zoom in on the back of the camera. And I zoom all the way in the water and start to look around until I start to see enough of that detail starting to come through, and to the point to where I can still see plenty of motion. That's kind of when I say, okay, you know what, that's the shutter speed that I want to go for. But if I had to give a number, I would say that I'm usually somewhere between 1/5 of a second and maybe 1/25th of a second, depending on the flow of the water. But I feel like I'm somewhere almost always in that range.
Mm-hmm. Okay, question from Larry. Do you take vertical panorama of those large waterfall?
Larry, I don't, but I should. There's actually a couple of images in this presentation where I wish I did take a vertical panorama, but my excuse for not doing it is I don't have a good pano head for my ball head or my tripod, and it's a little bit clumsy. The one that I have is a little bit messed up, I should say, and I haven't done it, but I should. And shooting panos is something that I don't do enough in general, not just with waterfall photography, but it's something I want to do more of for sure.
Okay, question from Sastry. So do you prefer the fixed ISO 100 over the auto ISO?
Yes, I would not recommend using auto ISO ever, mainly because I'm afraid that you could get into a situation where you would come away with an image that you absolutely love, but then you get the image back home and you realize how overexposed it might look. And it's because your camera selected ISO like 64,000. And from my experience, a camera in auto ISO will always introduce so much ISO. And I don't think you ever want that, because that's can definitely ruin your overall photograph. I really recommend not using any auto functions like that. If you do have to use any of the automatic shooting modes, I would recommend aperture priority or shutter speed priority, or of course just using full manual, but I probably wouldn't recommend auto ISO.
Mm-hmm. Okay, a question from Azam. Would a Wacom tablet be a better process?
Yeah, I actually have a Wacom tablet, and I use it. I kind of go back and forth, honestly, but yeah, I think Wacom tablets are absolutely tremendous to use. Or iPad Pro with the pen. I actually have one right here. I use this a lot too, but the Wacom tablet is better with pressure sensitivity than the iPad pen. But using a tablet is an extremely precise way to edit your photos, and it's a lot of fun too. It feels more like you're drawing. But yeah, I use that from time to time as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, question from Dave. Why use the radial filters instead of the adjustment brush?
Good question. So the adjustment brush, it makes it very easy to create an unnatural look when you're using the adjustment brush sometimes. And you'll notice when I was painting the adjustment brush on the actual water, I refined that with a range mask. Because a lot of times if you go over an area twice with the adjustment brush, you can kind of create an unnatural feather. So of course, when you're picking your adjustment brush, you determine how big that feather is, so how far that gradual transition is from the side, or that softening. But if you go over that area multiple times or different directions, you kind of ruin that feather, and it just creates an opportunity to create a very uneven look. And probably the only time I ever use an adjustment brush is when I'm actually painting it on water. But then I always will go back and refine it with a range mask. So that kind of gets away from that issue that could be created by going over an area more than one time.
Okay. Question from Gina. What tripod do you suggest?
So I use the Really Right Stuff TVC 34L with a BH40 ball head. And I would suggest that. I think that I've had it for years and they're absolutely fantastic. And I also use a Photo Pros tripod and they're absolutely tremendous as well. I've never had problems with either of them. Neither of them, or I should say neither of them are the cheapest solutions out there. They're both pricey, but when it comes to tripods, I wish I could show you. I've got probably like 7 or 8 tripods that range from about $50 up to a few $100s. Because when I first got started, I thought, you know, why spend a lot of money on a tripod? It's just going to hold your camera there. So I would go cheap. And then every time I'd buy a little bit more expensive and a little bit more expensive one. And if you were to sum together all the cheaper tripods I bought over time, they would equal more than my Really Right Stuff and my Photo Pro tripods. So what's the saying? Buy right once and not buy twice, or I don't know. There's some kind of saying like that. But when it comes to a tripod, I really think that spending a little bit more money and getting a solid, good, sturdy tripod is definitely worth the money for sure. But check out Really Right Stuff and Photo Pro for sure.
Okay. Question from Jane. Do you use auto mask or range mask, and how do you determine which one to use, and do you prefer on one over the other?
The radio. What was the first part?
Auto mask or range mask?
Auto mask. I use range mask. So I find that range mask gives you more flexibility because with the auto mask, it's just basically Lightroom will just automatically mask it for you. It doesn't quite give you a lot of flexibility like range mask does, because with range mask, you have the ability to target the highlights. You have the ability to target the shadows. You have the ability to determine how refined or how loosely refined your mask actually is. So I'm a huge fan of the range mask. I honestly think it's probably the single best tool that was ever implemented inside of Lightroom.
Okay. And yeah, James want you to repeat which wide angle lens are you using?
I use the Fujifilm 8 to 16 millimeter 2.8. which is an absurdly expensive lens. I think it was like $2,400, but it's an absolutely tremendous lens. And what I've found is that these lenses, they really are good investments. They last you forever as long as you take care of them. And I've dropped many of my lenses before and they all work perfectly fine. So a lot of them are built pretty robust. So I think it's definitely worth the money to spend a little bit more, but it's expensive.
Okay. Any tips on the tripod care or things to do after you're using the tripod in the stream to ensure it lasts for a long time?
Oh my gosh, I wish I would have put that in the presentation. Yes, probably the best tip that I have, I got to show you. It's this. So whenever you are in the water, it's easy to think that you should just loosen this leg. But I would always recommend loosening the bottom leg or the smallest leg down here and extending this one out. And because ideally you want the joint of the tripod above the water. So if you loosen or if you let out this bottom portion or the lower leg, more than likely the joint here is going to be above the water. And a lot of times when you're shooting seascapes or waterfall photography, these joints get mucked up with sand and mud and dirt that's just flowing through the water. But so trying to keep these joints above the surface level is definitely worth it. Sometimes you can't, but if you were to not extend the lower leg and extend only this top leg, that would basically mean that every single one of these joints is going to be underwater, which means is ultimately they're all going to get mucked up with, gooped up with all the kind of sand and dirt and grime. And it becomes a mess, and then they don't open well and they don't release well. And it's not a good situation to get into. So yeah, always extend that lower leg first.
Yeah, I have a small tips for those of you who doesn't like to clean the tripod. In the past, I used to put the plastic bag like the umbrella cover. Yeah, just put it in the legs, and then
Oh yeah,
and then
just in the water.
Yeah, and dip it in the water, and
That's a
then
good
just
idea.
and then just take it off after the shooting. Yeah.
Yeah, because those twist locks,
Mm-hmm.
it's amazing when they get just a little bit of sand, they become such a pain. And I can't tell you how many times I've been to an amazing location and I can't get the legs of my tripod to extend out,
Yeah.
no matter how hard I yank on them.
Mm-hmm.
And then you got to go back to your hotel room and take the whole thing apart. And taking a shower with your tripod, it sounds weird, but that's also another thing you can do is
Yeah.
cleaning up after a shoot, open up your tripod in the shower and just rinse the whole thing off and open up all the legs. But everyone probably thinks I'm a weirdo now for saying that.
Yeah, another suggestion is that always buy the tripod with the twist lock, because it's easy to remove, to clean. Because I have tripod with the what is called the clam locks or something.
like latches.
Yeah, those are very difficult to clean, and you need the tool to remove it. And
Yeah, it's too much like engineering work to take those apart. I like the twist locks. You can take them all apart in just a minute.
Yeah. Okay. Question from Dave. Do you have a YouTube video explaining the range mask?
Yeah, I do actually. If you just Google, if you look up on YouTube range masks, I think that my video will probably pop up in the top maybe 3 or 5. But yeah, I do have a video on range masks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another question. What is your honest opinion on getting in and out of the English Fall?
I think it's very, very dangerous, actually. And it's, it's such an amazing waterfall. It really, really is. It's kind of hard to find. A lot of people don't know about it, but it's not the easiest thing to get down to. But if you're very, very careful, my only recommendation is to not go by yourself. Definitely go with somebody and take your time and you'll be okay. But just definitely go with somebody there and let somebody know where you're going to.
Okay, and question for Ellie. When you're out shooting, do you always feel like the goal is to get the perfect photo, or do you also feel that it's about the experience?
And for me, it's about the experience, and it's something that has really evolved for me over the last 6 or 7 years. Because when I first got into this, I put so much pressure on myself to where I'd plan a shoot, and then I'd pay money to get to a location, and then I'd pay hotels and rental cars, and then you get there, you put a lot of pressure on yourself to come away with an amazing photograph. It's only natural. You spend a lot of money and time to get there. You want a good photo, but a lot of times that pressure can ruin your trip. So I really focus more on the overall experience now, and mainly because like if you look at any of your photographs, it'll evoke a lot of emotions and a lot of memories from when you capture that image. So I think the photographs are kind of meaningless to the photographer if you completely remove all the memories and all the stories of capturing that. So the overall experience to me is the most important part of the photograph. And the photograph is really that trophy or that keepsake or that memory of the overall location. So experience over photograph all day long.
Yeah, I agree with you. Sometimes I went travel and come back with a bunch of photo, but I didn't even remember where I have been to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it really can ruin your time when you start to get so fixated on capturing that amazing photograph. But if you just look around and realize where you are and you're looking at the northern lights or whatever the case may be, and just really soak it all in, because it's all about the experience.
Yeah. So question from Dave, do you prefer to have the sun shining on the fall or shining from behind them?
Fantastic question. I prefer no sun at all for waterfall photography. So I think the best situation to shoot waterfalls is on an overcast day. So where there is not direct water or direct sunlight on the waterfalls. And mainly because when you have direct light on moving water, you get all this kind of glistening look, all these like hot spots of highlights popping. And when you capture that, it's very, very distracting in an image to have all these, it looks like thousands of little flashlights shooting up from beneath the water. So ideally, an overcast day where the lighting is very even and there's no direct light at all on the actual landscape. So I always say no sunlight on the waterfall at all.
Okay, another question about focus. Where to focus in order to get everything in focus?
Oh, very tough question. It depends on how close the closest object is in your scene. I would say a good rule of thumb is to focus 1/3 of the way into your scene. So if you're looking on your LCD camera and if you kind of divide the scene into a third, so you have your bottom third, your middle third, and then your top third. If you focus somewhere in that middle third, a lot of times that will get you where you need to be if you have an aperture around maybe f11 to f16, where you have a lot of depth of field. But it's a tough thing to really answer because it depends on how close the closest object is to your lens and how far away the farthest away item in your scene is. But 1/3 of the way into your scene is always a good starting point.
Okay, and question from Oshima on YouTube. So your Photoshop manager 1/3 of the luminance mask generator. What was that?
In Photoshop?
Yeah.
Oh, I know what you're saying. I use
Yeah.
oh my gosh, what do I use? I forgot the name of it. I'm trying to find it. Oh, Lumenzia. I use Lumenzia for my luminosity masking in Photoshop. Very simple to use.
Okay. So question from Dennis. Do you offer any course or you have the videos how to use the software?
To use, yeah, I've got quite a few videos all about Lightroom. And if you go to my YouTube channel, if you just look up on YouTube, Mark Denney, Denney, you'll find my channel. And I've got a couple playlists dedicated all to post-processing in Photoshop and Lightroom. But yeah, I've got a lot of videos that break down different techniques and tips and tricks for editing outdoor photos using Lightroom.
Okay, question from Juan. What weather apps do you use?
Oh, good question. So I use WeatherBug for my general information. I use an app called Light Track to determine exactly where the sun is going to rise or set. I like Light Track because it's just so simple. It only does one thing and it's a very simple user interface. But I also use Photo Pills and the Photographer's Ephemeris. But I'm trying to think what else. Oh, I got to tell you this one. I'm drawing a complete blank. It's called Clear Outside. And what Clear Outside is it will tell you the propensity or the likelihood for certain layers of cloud. So ideally, if you're looking for like a long burning sunrise or sunset, high clouds, those are the wispy clouds high in the sky. Those usually catch a lot of that light, give you those explosive magenta tones and fiery oranges and reds. But low clouds is really what you don't want because that's going to snuff out a lot of the color or sunrise. So if you find a day where there's very little low clouds or maybe just a little bit of medium clouds and a fair amount of high clouds, that's a good recipe for a nice explosive sunrise or sunset. And Clear Outside will break that down for you by cloud layers. So high clouds, medium clouds, and low clouds. And that's one of my go-to apps. It's a free app. I believe it's available I know it's available for iPhone, and I think it is for Android as well. But check out Clear Outside.
Okay, another question is a replay of this webinar. Yeah, so we have this webinar recorded on YouTube and on Facebook. You can always visit the YouTubes or Facebooks of the NiSi Optic USA. You can always play back the seminar. Okay, I hope I capture all the questions from Zoom and from the YouTube and Facebook. But if I miss something and if you're still on the Zoom, so you can unmute your mic and ask a question. So this is the last chance to ask a question. Anyone?
Oh, I see Jenna said Clear Outside is available on Android. Awesome. I wasn't sure about that.
Okay, so Mark, you have anything to add before we end the meeting today?
Yeah, I just want to thank you all. Like I said, I know how valuable everyone's time is, and I really do appreciate it. Let me, I do have, let's see. If you have any additional questions, you can get in touch with me via my website at markdenneyphotography.com. I can be found on Instagram under Mark Denney Photo and Twitter under Mark Denney Photo. And of course, my YouTube channel, if you just look up Mark Denney, you'll be able to find me there as well. And you can get in contact with me really via any of those channels. I'm pretty easy to get in touch with, and I'll do my best to get back in touch with you as quick as I possibly can. But thank you all very much. I had a blast tonight. I can't believe it's already been 90 minutes. I could go another 90 minutes talking about this stuff, but you made my night, you made my week, and I really do appreciate it. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, for your wonderful presentation. So last thing I want to share with you is that if you're going to buy filters, you can use the coupon code here and live 15 Mark to take 15% off from the NiSiOpticUSA.com. And yeah, so with that, thank you everyone. Thank you, Mark, for your wonderful presentations.
Absolutely.
Yep. So we'll call it a day. Thank you, everyone.
That's good. Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Talk to you all later. Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Take care.
Bye.
Good evening,
Thanks,
Mark.
Mark. Great presentation.
Oh, cool. I can talk to everybody now.
Yeah, there you go.
Good
Awesome.
job, Mark.
Was it a helpful discussion?
Yes, it
very
was.
much.
Oh, yes,
Very
very
good.
much so.
Awesome. Looking forward to the next one.
It's so weird doing these Zoom because there's no feedback. It's so much different than presenting in front of people because I can see if they're enjoying it or not. So now I just have to go on a whim and just hope and pray that this is resonating with everybody. So
Oh, sure
Oh,
is.
yeah.
That's very good. I'm going to go out and shoot a waterfall this weekend. So
awesome. I'm doing the
Great,
same
thank you.
thing. I got myself fired up about shooting waterfalls. I was going through this. I was like, man, I'm feeling really jazzed to get out there and find some
Yep.
flowing water. So I got to be doing something right, I guess.
I got into it about
Waterfall
a year
Brazil.
ago, and I've been finding waterfalls all over the New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania area, and it's absolutely fascinating.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, for me, nothing beats waterfalls. That's the what do they say? The cat's pajamas.
That's right. Yeah. Thanks very much. I enjoyed it.
Oh, I'm glad to hear it. So thank you all very much. I really do appreciate it.
Thanks again,
Hey, have a
Mark.
good evening.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, Joanne.
Thank
You have a good
you.
evening too.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Mark.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Tim.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
thank you.